Okay, hi Ed. Thank you so much for joining us today, and for taking part in this ASAA oral history project. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and really
Thanks for
looking.
having me. It's great to
Yeah.
be here.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. Could you just maybe start with telling us a little bit about who you are and when, where, and how your path to Asian studies began?
So my name is Edward Aspinall, and I am a professor of politics in the Department of Political and Social Change, which is located in the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs in the College of Asia Pacific in the ANU. It's quite a mouthful. And my pathway into Asian studies really began a long time ago. So if I go right back to the beginning, I spent time living in Indonesia as a teenager with my parents. So my father was an agricultural scientist, and back in the 1980s, I went with my family. Well, yeah, I went with my family for a couple of years to the town of Malang in East Java, and that's what got me interested in Indonesia. And from there, um, I um, I went back to Australia to go to high school, learned Indonesian at high school and then Indonesian at university as well, at Flinders University. And from there, everything developed. And so I went on to later do a PhD on Indonesian politics, and that's what I do now. So I'm a specialist in the politics of Indonesia, but also with comparative interests in other countries throughout Southeast Asia.
Wonderful. And I wonder, like, is there a particular book or film or encounter that you had either growing up or in your career that has been particularly influential in making you the kind of scholar you are today?
Obviously the super formative experience was actually that period of living in Indonesia as a teenager. But then later on, a little later on, I'd moved, after I finished my undergraduate degree, I'd moved to Sydney and I was doing other things. And I was involved there in a group, an activist group with a number of other people who were interested in supporting um, similar sort of like-minded activists within Indonesia. There were a lot of people involved, but people like Emma Bolsh, for example, who now works at Monash University in Malaysia. And we were in contact with a lot of Indonesian student activists at that time, and some of them came out and met us. Um, and that was really got me interested in researching that particular aspect of Indonesian politics. This was the early 90s. Things were starting to move within Indonesia. When I'd lived there as a teenager, it was a very closed and repressive society. But there was this emergence of this new student movement in particular, which was challenging the regime. So I went on to, from that, started to collect materials that these students were producing. A lot of them were actually in the form of defense speeches in trials, because a lot of them were put on trial for subversion. And from there, I went on to do an honours thesis on that topic at Sydney University. And that's what sort of then set me on the path to research Indonesian politics more deeply through a PhD.
Wow, that's so interesting. And um, could you tell us a bit about that kind of initial foray into research in Indonesia and Asian studies, whether your honors degree or in your PhD? How did you go about your first project? What were the skills and knowledge you needed to complete it?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd spent time in Indonesia previously, either living there with my parents or just, backpacking around. And I'd learned Indonesian through that process. So the honors thesis I didn't have much money at the time, so it was basically a textual analysis using, media reports and also those other sorts of documents I mentioned. But then when I started my PhD, and it was on more broadly opposition movements under the Suharto regime at that time, um, probably the best bit of advice I had was from my supervisor at that time, the late Harold Crouch. He said, it's going to take you a while to, develop the sort of networks you need. So he actually suggested I just take a year off and go and live in Jakarta, which is what I did. And that's when I just started to hang out with, members of student groups. I used to go a lot to the legal aid office and volunteer help with translation, that sort of thing at there. The legal aid office in Jakarta was sort of a hub of activism. And I began to meet people that way. And that's how I really began to, I guess, develop the sort of, skills which I've relied on throughout my career, which is, it's not only having the sort of the language skills and the general sort of cultural competence, but knowing the particular, I guess, subculture of politics in Indonesia, the sorts of language that people use to describe political action. That's how I did it. It was a sort of a deep immersion thing, I guess you would call it, right? Hanging out at, with student activist groups, traveling around, visiting different markas or headquarters, as they called them, and sleeping with everyone else in these student activist centers, and just talking to a lot of people. So that's really how I started. And from there, of course, after that, I mean, at that stage, we didn't really get much sort of methods training or anything of that sort. But from that, it was just a sort of process of learning by doing, building up the sort of, especially, I mean, I'm basically a fieldwork sort of a person. So a lot of my research is based on interviews and direct observation. Obviously, we don't have time to, spend longer in the field. But that's where I learned all of those sorts of skills. Yeah, there's no substitute for spending a lot of time in the
Yeah.
country. I think. Yeah.
It's such an immersive approach to doing research. And I wonder, is that something that you've passed down to students that you've supervised after?
Certainly, yeah. So I think that's certainly a sort of, and more generally, I would say within my particular department where I work now at the ANU, that is definitely our orientation. I think we very, very rarely would supervise PhD students who don't spend a lot of time in the field. That really is what we emphasize. And it's really through that sort of rich encounter with, people who are engaged in the sort of political processes that we're studying that we can get a deep understanding of them. So yeah, that's definitely something I would still encourage
Yeah,
my students to pursue. Yeah.
that's so cool. Bringing you forward a little bit, I guess, into the research that you do in the current day or that you've done in your career since. I wonder if we can give the listener kind of a snapshot of the research that you do. So could you tell us maybe about a particular book or article or publication that you think best reflects your work?
Yeah. So my research has sort of tracked Indonesia's political history since the time that I began to do my PhD research. So my PhD and therefore my first book was sort of on the process of democratization. Then I wrote a book about a separatist conflict in the province of Aceh, because at post-democratization there was a lot of internal conflict in Indonesia. And then for a period I did a lot of research on how elections work in Indonesia, in particular this sort of developing trend of Indonesians call it politik uang or money politics, so vote buying, pork barrel politics, candidates winning elections by distributing material benefits of one sort or another to voters. So that's sort of been the most recent focus of my work. And part of that has involved big scale collaborative projects as well with colleagues in Indonesia. So working especially with, I've got a lot of colleagues I work closely with at Universitas Gadjah Mada in Jogja in particular, and we often organize these big teams of researchers to go out and observe elections, talk to candidates, talk to voters. But most recently, I also teamed up with colleagues working on other countries in Southeast Asia, in particular in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Thailand. And I am getting to your question. And so the most recent sort of co-authored book I wrote was called Mobilizing for Elections, and it was co-authored with Meredith Weiss, Alan Hick, and Paul Hutchcroft, and based on one of these big collaborative projects where we compared the different patterns of clientelistic or money politics across these countries, and we try to develop this argument about why it is that particular countries have different combinations of these sorts of practices, which we call electoral mobilization regime. So yeah, I'm really proud of that work, that it sort of brings some of this work I've been doing on Indonesia to, a bigger sort of broader comparative focus, and sort of does quite deep comparative, I think anyway, across several Southeast Asian countries, something that's quite hard to do given all the language barriers and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's such an accomplishment to have been able to do a study like that. And I wonder, how has your like specialist Indonesia training prepared you to engage in this broader comparative work across Southeast Asia?
Well, one of the great things I learned about doing that comparative work, and I've got to really underline that it's only really made possible in my case by having these great partners in these different countries, both those co-authors I mentioned, but also local research partners who are able to sort of introduce us to different field sites, help us make contact with different sorts of politicians and so on. So the great thing about comparative research is it's that shock of both noticing unexpected similarities across countries, but also unexpected differences. So one of the really remarkable things I find is that the sort of, for instance, yeah, a lot of the very specific techniques that politicians develop about vote buying, for example, to get around this problem of if you give people money, can you guarantee they're then going to vote for you, are so similar across different countries, suggesting that politicians in Thailand, in the Philippines, in Indonesia are facing these very similar sorts of problems, and they're coming up with quite similar sorts of solutions. And yet in other places, then we find, certain parts of Peninsular Malaysia, for example, that sort of individualized retail vote buying is quite rare. So why is that? Then you need to go back into history and explain these sorts of differences. So that's the exciting thing about, I mean, I really am an Indonesia specialist, and I will always focus on Indonesia in my research, and I have a deep love for doing research there. But you do expand your horizons by encountering comparable yet different political patterns in other countries. Yeah.
Exactly. That's wonderful. And I guess another trend that I'm picking up on in what you're saying is like this strong focus on collaboration. So both with people outside the region, but also internally in Indonesia. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you've experienced as like both the benefits and the challenges of working with collaborators in your fieldwork.
Well, I mean, I mean, the benefits are really obvious.
Yeah.
It it can, especially if you're collaborating with researchers who are located in the sort of the regions where you're conducting research. I mean, these people often have such, an incredible head start in terms of local knowledge, and then an ability to sort of open up the hidden world of politics locally, to forge connections with individuals, to provide the sort of background that for us it would often take as an outsider, it would often take years to develop. So that's the wonderful thing. Well, that's one of the many wonderful things about it. It's just this incredible opportunity to learn, not only to enhance your own research, but also to learn from the people you're collaborating with. Um, the challenges, well, not so much the challenges. I mean, part of the deal, I suppose, of doing that sort of research is that to make sure these relationships don't become exploitative. And that means involving developing these sorts of equal partnerships where you're developing in particular publication models where you're often in the case of Indonesia, it's often the local researchers have this incredible knowledge, but they lack experience in publishing internationally, but that's also very important for their own career development. Whereas someone like me has a lot of experience doing that now. So there's a sort of an exchange of sort of skills and knowledge and cooperation, which I also find very enjoyable. I mean, I would say the only big challenge of especially large scale collaborative research is that you end up spending a lot of time on project administration because there's a lot of contracts and money and deadlines and editing and all of that sort of thing to do. But um, it's something that it's an approach I've developed as my research career has developed. So early on when I was doing my PhD and in the first, I suppose, 10 years or so after my PhD, a lot of my research was that traditional sort of single researcher model. But as I've become more senior, I suppose, I've spent more and more of my time doing these big collaborative projects, and I really enjoy it.
That's so wonderful. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about in this oral history project is a lot about, I guess, the future of Asian studies in Australia. And I wondered if you had reflections about this model of collaboration with people in the field and the region and how that might play into the future of Asian studies in Australia.
Yeah, I think it has to be. I mean, that is one of the directions where we have to go, I guess. I mean, if we go back to the earlier period of the development of the field of Asian studies in Australia, and I guess in the 60s and 70s, this was in a period when universities in many countries of Asia, but in particular in Southeast Asia, were well, obviously there were some very strong universities, but overall the tertiary education and research field was much less developed. So Australia had this sort of opportunity, being embedded in the region, to develop this really outstanding level of comparative knowledge and expertise that took a sort of a region-wide scope, could had space for the development of, really deep country specialization, but Australia could become a country that, as the saying goes, was always really punching above its weight in terms of Asian studies. But that's really changing now, right? As the, uh, uh, as, you know, universities, research, that sort of whole world of research just develops, and I mean, it's just streets ahead of how it used to be in that period. And you can even see that in some of the numbers. So when Melissa Crouch and I did this project a couple of years ago, assessing the state of Asian studies in Indonesia, one of the remarkable things we found there was when we look at submissions to Asian Studies Review, the flagship publication of the association, just the number of submissions that we get from the region now is much, much higher than it used to be. So I feel that it's just a sort of an inevitable development that we would need to make or to pursue as advanced research, as the sort of the shift, as the sort of the center of gravity of Asian studies research shifts from these old sort of colonial metropoles or countries like Australia to, and the shift has already happened, in fact, to countries in the region, then we need to adjust. And part of that is, collaborating, building research links, but also pursuing other forms of cooperation across universities, joint degrees, university exchanges for our students, all of that sort of stuff. I think will have to occur, that we as a field in Australia will need to embed our work much more solidly in the region itself.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. And that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you next, which was a bit about your involvement in the life of the ASAA over the years. So you have been quite a prolific figure in the association, and I'm curious, how did you get involved with the Asian Studies Association of Australia to begin with?
So my very first experience, I was on the organizing committee of the annual conference back in, I feel that was 1998 at UNSW. So it was during my first, I was about to say post PhD, but I actually hadn't finished my PhD. Then my first academic job at UNSW, I was teaching Indonesian there. Um, and I was on the organizing committee of the conference. John Ingleson was the conference convener at that time. And from there, I had sort of sporadic involvement, engagement at particular moments. I was convener of another conference. I guess that would be in the mid 2010s at some point in Canberra. Um, Co-editor of the Southeast Asia publication series, so the book series, which I'm still doing today. And then I had a stint, a term as vice president, and then a term as president of the association around the very late 2010s, I guess. I did write down the years, yeah, 2017 through to 2020, more or less. Yeah, so that was a great experience to be able to do that. I mean, one of the big things we did or sort of towards the end of my time there, actually, and then as Kate McGregor and Melissa Crouch were taking over, I just wanted to get this out. I don't know if this will be legible
Wonderful.
on screen, but anyway, Melissa Crouch and I wrote that Australia's Asia Education Imperative, so the report on the state of Asian studies in Australia. There's been this long history of producing these big sort of stock takes of the field over time. So that was one of the big things we initiated at that time. And that was a wonderful experience. Yeah. So I have, to cut a long story short, yes, intermittently, I've been very engaged. Yeah. At particular moments. Yeah.
Extremely. Let me ask you a little bit about the report itself. So this was, as you said, it was a massive report, and actually recently it's found popularity again. There was an ABC segment that profiled the report that was on social media as well recently. So
Right.
something that's still having relevance. What were the motivations behind finding behind doing the report, and what were some of the findings that were unexpected or interesting for you?
Yeah, I mean, the motivation partly was that we just felt that there was a need for a stock take.
Yeah.
I guess there was also a feeling amongst many colleagues that the field was, if not in crisis, at least it was facing some difficulties. Concern about language enrolments in particular remains a big concern, I think. So that was part of what motivated us. Some of the findings that surprised me. I mean, one of the things I found was that the experience of different sort of subfields is often so different. So, for example, when we talk to people in the Korean studies field, many of them were actually very sort of positive and optimistic, and talked about things like the influence of, contemporary Korean pop culture, K-pop, all of that as having quite a significant effect in terms of boosting student numbers. Whereas people from other subfields, even like Indonesian studies, for example, which is actually very strong in Australia until this day, are very concerned and remain very worried, I think, about the decline of language enrollment. So that was I guess, one of the big things. The other big themes for me, I guess, is this, and this is something that's been tracked over a long time, but this shift from a sort of an older sort of area studies, um, concentrated Asia studies model where you bring people who are working on Asia into particular university departments or centers in a cross-disciplinary sense versus this sort of broader model where you hope that, as Australia becomes more sort of Asia savvy, that universities will themselves adjust and recruit people with an interest in conducting research in Asia in all sorts of disciplines and all sorts of parts of the university. And yeah, I guess we found a sort of a mixed picture there that especially in some of the traditional disciplines, history, etc., that doesn't seem to be going so well. But then we find all these other fields, in particularly ones that were at least traditionally outside the sort of core disciplines we'd associate with Asian studies like architecture and design and so on, where you do find this sort of broad presence of people with an Asia focus. So yeah, there were a lot of interesting findings in that report, and yes, I would encourage everyone watching to go back and read it.
Exactly. I would too. I was involved, I think, in a research assistant capacity on the report.
Indeed, you were. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Some stages along the way, so I also feel very passionately that people should go and read it. Moving, I guess, from the report to how you feel about some of these topics, I wonder, like, how do you assess the state of either Indonesian studies or Asian studies in Australia? And what do you see as the main strengths and challenges for the field?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people in the field, I guess I'm a bit, I sort of fluctuate through these moments of great confidence, r- recognizing that, comparatively speaking, I mean, at least across most non-Asian developed countries, let's put it like that way, that our field is still pretty strong in Australia. Certainly the depth of Indonesia research in particular is quite remarkable. I mean, that's what I would know the best. But then sometimes you just get this fear that a lot of that is sort of resting on past achievements, and we worry about regeneration, about pipeline. In particular, the big concern, I think, is um, language study. And there are sort of general trends there that are sort of um, flowing against language study right across well, not only Asian languages, but I do worry a lot about things like the decline of Indonesian in particular, but recently it seems also Chinese, both, well, first of all at the school level and then with flow through effects into university. So I do have concerns about that, those sort of long-term problems that have long been identified as an issue, I think. Um, and I mean, I guess one of the achievements recently is that message does seem to be getting through to government, but whether there's yet the political will to do something really substantial about it on a level that had been done, a generation or two ago by previous governments to address some of these problems. I mean, that really does remain to be seen.
Yeah, totally. No, I totally agree. And you touched on in the report this kind of debate between like the mainstreaming of Asian studies education in Australia versus like the preservation of Asian specialty majors and departments. Like, how do you view this debate? Is it useful for us? Is it helping us in any way? Where do you land?
I mean, I guess, obviously a crude sort of binary version of the debate, I don't think is very useful. And a lot of um, a lot of universities wouldn't be in a position anyway to like really build big concentrated Asia centers or Asian studies departments or things like that. So I think, I mean, it will vary a lot from location to location, but I think the critical thing is to for colleagues at particular universities to um, develop ways in which they can sort of combine the best of both worlds. And that's really what you want, right? You do want a broad presence of people working on Asian topics across a lot of disciplines, including in sort of unexpected places. But you do also want to provide the avenues or the networks for people working on particular countries or particular regions to come together across disciplines. So a lot of universities try to bridge this gap by setting up, centers that can then reach out to people working in different schools or departments across their universities. I mean, my fear is that, I mean, I guess that there's a sort of an institutional issue, right? That at least if you have a dedicated Asia center, which has its own academic staff, that sort of center can always be vulnerable when there's a major budgetary crisis at a particular university. But at least you know that that signals a commitment to keep renewing staff, whereas the sort of the broad presence everywhere strategy is only a strategy when senior university leaders and administrators themselves recognize the importance of recruiting people with a background in Asia. That often, if it comes to appointing a staff member in I don't know let's say a school of politics or whatever it is, the emphasis will often be, well, we need someone who can teach our first year course on Australian politics, or there's often a sort of an urgent requirement that trumps Asia expertise. So that's what I'm concerned about. That without some sort of an institutional backup or ballast, there's always a chance that when times get tough, Asia expertise sort of drops to the bottom of the list of priorities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's really insightful. And where does the ASAA come in, do you think, in terms of like helping with the current challenges that we see with the state of the field? Is it in advocacy? Is it in visibility? Like, how do you think the ASAA should be helping?
Yeah, I think it's definitely both of those things. It's
Mhm.
also providing a sort of a support and an institutional backbone that helps, you know, networking and provides opportunities in particular for individuals who might be isolated in particular parts of their universities or in particular universities to come across and recognize, there is a strong network of people working on their country or in their field right across the country. But I think that public facing and advocacy role has to be important. It was really important, I think, in the early years of the ASAA, um, when some of the founders of the association did have quite good entree into government. That's something that's very hard to rebuild, I think, and it's not something we've tried. It's not always that easy. Um, but just generally raising the public visibility of the field and developments in it, the trends in language teaching, for example, getting the media interested in these topics, that is really a critical role for the ASAA. And the ASAA has historically played a really important role there,
Yeah.
putting the field on the public agenda.
Yeah, exactly. You're also so right to touch on the human aspect of it and the way that connecting with people across institutions can really help. Yeah, that's so wonderful. And I guess turning then to like, what's exciting to you about research in the field at the moment? So the question is like, what topics or subfields do you think are most exciting for you at the moment? But to ask it another way, say there was a hypothetical world where you didn't have to do any project administration, none of those burdens. There were like five versions of you that could go anywhere in Indonesia or the world. What would you be researching?
I was going to say that sounds like my happy place, but the problem is that a lot of the things I would be researching at the moment are a little depressing, really,
Right.
because I'm a politics person, right, and a political science, and as I said before, my sort of research career has sort of tracked the the sort of cycles of Indonesia, or the pathway, I guess, of Indonesian political history over the last 2 or 3 decades. And right now, like not just in Indonesia, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally, I mean, a lot of the big topics that people who work on politics need to grapple with are these issues to do with, democratic decline, elite capture of political institutions, the sort of uh, you know, capacities that ordinary citizens, but also civil society groups and others do have to resist these sorts of trends. So that's probably the sort of area I would be working on. I mean, I would be doing it much more differently than I would have done it when I began my career. I think, for example, the sort of field of politics is quite different now in Indonesia than it was when I began. So there would be all sorts of topics about like gender equality, for example, which would be much more further to the fore in a big ambitious, what was it, five simultaneous research projects plan, like you suggested. But that would be the sort of area I would be looking at, sort of topics to do with democratic resilience, drivers of, populism, democratic decline. But in particular, I'd like to look at how ordinary people would be um, positioning themselves in relation to those big themes. So how do people get involved in politics? What do they? I feel that a lot of the field of political science has these very abstracted concepts like democracy, for example, which become increasingly elaborate as generations of political science kind of build these big structures on the concepts that have come before them. And I'd like to try to think of new ways about how ordinary people themselves understand these concepts and how those understandings shape their engagement, and then how those sorts of processes connect to the bigger sort of processes of regime change that ultimately I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe after I retire.
Oh, great. Well, we'll look forward to all the research that's to come then. And you've been very generous with your time, so I'll ask one more question and then we'll leave it there. What are some things that us as Asianists, either collectively or individually, might be able to do to better prepare ourselves for a future in Asian studies?
Right. Um, I mean, I think the big thing is just to make sure that we're still doing really amazing research. I mean, I think that's, in the long run, people in our field will defend the position of our field in Australian universities by ensuring that our research is really, world class, to use a very hackneyed phrase these days, but to make sure we really are at the cutting edge of the field, that we're producing, new understandings of, in whatever discipline we're working in, that are important, that people who are interested in researching Asian countries feel that they really need to read. I think that's the main thing. Because I have this naive faith, perhaps, that in the end, that sort of quality research, is its own sort of justification, and will get through to university leaders and so on. The other thing I would say is we do need, and this is where the ASAA comes in, but there's a lot that individuals can do as well, is doing what we can to ensure that, our research does have a public profile beyond academia. And part of that is the sort of lobbying work or advocacy work we talked about before. But part of it is also just to ensure that you know, um, we're doing what we can to try to ensure that our research findings do reach a wider audience than just academics, whether that's publishing in non-academic outlets or, appearing in the media, or all of those sorts of things that don't often get a lot of reward in sort of academic career structures. But I think there is a need to develop, you know, not necessarily broad public awareness, but at least some sort of public buy-in, some recognition that what we're doing is important for the public and therefore hopefully for decision makers. So those would be two big things. The third thing, which I think is really challenging and which does concern me, but I don't have a lot of solutions necessarily, but I, I, I feel we need to do what we can to think about how we can support the study of, in particular, Asian languages in schools, especially in high schools. Um, I feel that the key is to the sort of long-term continuity of our field, at least to the generation of sort of homegrown Asia expertise, is in the development of language skills and that pipeline into universities. I mean, it's not the only way to do it, but I think it is important. And it's just very concerning to see, even here in Canberra, we're frequently hearing reports of the struggles of the local Indonesian teachers to maintain offerings, to maintain programs at particular schools. So I don't think, certainly I haven't cracked, how it is that we can do that and what we can offer to high school students. But I know that a lot of the language teachers at universities do dedicate themselves to going out and doing outreach to high schools and so on. And I think that's really important and often underappreciated work. So that would be the third thing, the third sort of big challenge that I feel we have. But I don't necessarily have a great solution for it either. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but that's really helpful and all great things to be thinking about. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think I think we've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, I just encourage people themselves to get involved in the work of the Asian Studies Association of Australia. It's a great organization to be in. You can, you're not only contributing to the field, but you can also get a lot out of it in terms of your own personal, professional career development. So long live the ASAA. That's my final word.
Let's say no more.